Hi, and welcome to Nevaeh's Nightmare. In this episode, we will be exploring a historical mystery. In July of 1918, the former Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, his wife, and his 5 children were killed by the Bolsheviks. Nearly 2 years later, in February 1920, a young woman was rescued from a freezing river in the middle of Berlin. This young woman would come to be known to the world as Anna Anderson, but there were some people that were convinced that she was the lost daughter of the Tsar named Anastasia. Was she? We'll find out. Before we turn to the case of Anna Anderson and her identity, we should set some historical background. In early 1917, Russia was involved with fighting the First World War. The war had put a strain on the Russian economy, and the Romanov dynasty that had ruled for over 300 years had begun to lose its authority over the people. In March, a revolution broke out in the capital of Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate his throne. A new provisional government took over the country, and one of the problems it faced was what to do with the Tsar and his family. First, the Tsar, his wife, Alexandria, and their 5 children went to the palace on the outskirts of the city. The children included their youngest and former heir to the throne, Alexei and Anastasia, the youngest of the 4 daughters. In the palace the family lived in was relatively comfortable, but this was not to last. In the summer, the new Prime Minister, Kerensky, was facing some political problems and had the former royal family moved into the town of Tobolsk in Siberia, where they lived a little bit more roughly than before, but were not ill-treated. Meanwhile, back in Petrograd, the provisional government faced challenges to its power from many different directions. One of these was Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik or Communist Party. The Bolsheviks promised that they would end the war, which was popular among the people. In November, the Bolsheviks staged a coup and took over the government. Now authority over the former royal family fell into their hands, and they hated the Tsar. By the summer of 1918, Russia had spiraled into a civil war. On one side were the communists, the Reds, and the other side the Whites, who wanted to destroy the communist government. In the spring, fearing that the royal family would fall into the hands of the Whites and the Tsar would be restored to the throne, they were moved once again to Yekaterinburg. By July, the town was on the verge of being taken by White forces, and order was given to execute the Tsar and his entire family. In the early morning of July 17th, the former royal family were stirred out of their beds by the Bolshevik guards. The family and some of the attendants had stayed with them, including their personal doctor, Yevgeny Botkin. Remember that last name because it'll come up again. They were assembled in the basement and told they were taking a group picture. Then the guards entered the room, lined up, one of them read an order of execution, and then they all fired at point-blank range, killing the royal family. Or so the official story goes. Actually, there never really was an official story. The Bolsheviks would deny that they had executed the royal family, saying that any reports that they did were just white propaganda. When the Whites took over Yekaterinburg, they found the bodies of the attendants, including Dr. Botkin, but not those of the royal family. Over the next few years, rumors began to spread that certain members of the family survived. These seemed to focus on the survival of Alexei and Anastasia, and reported sightings of them were made. Eventually, many of the extended royal family members had to leave Russia as the Whites were finally defeated in 1920, and the Soviet Union was formed in 1922. In February of 1920, almost 2 years after the Tsar and his family were killed in Russia, a young woman jumped off a bridge in Berlin, Germany. The young woman had attempted to commit suicide, but the authorities managed to save her from the freezing river, and they took her here to the Dalforth Mental Asylum. The young woman seemed to have amnesia and couldn't remember her own name, thus she was known as Miss No Name by the medical staff. They noted that she spoke German, but had an accent that the staff described as Russian. The young woman stayed at the asylum, and over the course of 2 years, she still did not remember who she was or where she had come from. Then in early 1922, another inmate began to claim that the young woman was the Grand Duchess Tatiana, another daughter of Nicholas II. When the patient was released, she went to a former white Russian captain named Nicholas von Schwab and insisted that he see this mysterious young woman. He went to Daldorf and he agreed that she might be Tatiana. He soon brought others to see the young woman, and they also became convinced. One of the former servants of the royal family then came to visit and stated she was too tall to be Tatiana, to which a few days later, the young woman declared that she never said she was Tatiana. After this, a nurse at the hospital claimed that the mysterious woman had said she was Anastasia. After all this, the young woman was moved out of the asylum and into the home of a wealthy Russian immigrant. Others became convinced that she was indeed Anastasia, and she took the name Anna Tchaikovsky, and Anna being the shortened form of Anastasia. Members of the extended royal family would come to visit her and to see if she was indeed the long-lost Grand Duchess. Some of them were convinced, and some of them were not, but they remained open to the possibility that she still might be. One of those who was not fully convinced was a distant cousin of the deceased czar, the Duke of Leuchtenberg. Nevertheless, he put Anna, as we shall call her from now on, up on his residence in the castle of Soon in 1927. I said that wrong. It's Seon in 1927. The Duke employed a private investigator named Martin Knopf to find out who Anna might actually be. Knopf became convinced that she was actually a Polish factory worker named Francesca Trzaskowska. This girl had worked at a ammunitions factory during World War I, and a grenade had fallen out of her hand and exploded. Before this, her fiancé had died at the front, and the trauma these two incidents caused a mental breakdown. Francesca had been committed and released from an asylum, and one day she had walked away from her home and was never seen or heard from again. Knopf had managed to track down her brother, and he visited Anna. The brother was convinced that she was indeed his sister, but he signed a letter declaring that he wasn't sure, and we'll talk about his reasons for doing so later. Soon Anna's claim to be Anastasia had caught the attention of Gleb Bodkin, the son of Dr. Bodkin, the Tsar's personal physician who had died with the royal family in 1918. He convinced a wealthy distant cousin of the Romanovs to bring Anna to the United States. It is here that her cause came into the popular consciousness, and she became a subject of great curiosity in the press. Anna lived with some of the wealthiest people in New York City, and she became the toast of the town. Anna began to show erratic behavior and threw tantrums, and one of these tantrums she even managed to kill her favorite pet parakeet. Because of this type of behavior, she was quietly sent back to Germany, where Gleb Bodkin, however, would continue to support her and defend her against the members of the Romanov family, who insisted she was nothing more than an imposter. From 1931 to 1968, Anna lived in Germany, and the controversy continued. Even the Nazis got involved, and when they arranged a meeting with the Trzaskowski family, and they said later that they were convinced that Anna was their lost sister Francesca, but fearing that she would be imprisoned by the Nazis, they didn't speak up. At the end of World War II, Anna lived in what was then the Soviet zone of occupation, and fearing that the Soviets would arrest her, one of the royal supporters helped her move to the American-occupied part of Germany. She would live there until 1968 in an old crumbling house surrounded by cats. Because of her increasingly bizarre and erratic behavior, Anna was forced to leave the house once it was condemned. Gleb Bodkin stepped in and gave her support to move back to the United States. Anna changed her last name to Anderson, and she ended up in Charlottesville, Virginia, under the watchful eye of Gleb Bodkin. To avoid being deported back to Germany, she married an eccentric college professor named Jack Manahan. The couple became renowned in Charlottesville as extremely odd people. They lived in an old house in virtual squalor, surrounded by dogs and cats. At one point in the late 70s, Anna and her husband were once featured on the TV show In Search Of, about whether or not she was actually Anastasia. Anna Anderson died in 1984 with no resolution to her true identity. Flash forward to 1991, the remains of the former Russian royal family were found in Ekaterinburg in 1979, but the Soviet government had kept a lid on this. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union had begun to crumble, and information finally got out. In 1991, the remains of the Tsar, his wife, and the 3 daughters were DNA tested, and it was definitely proven that they had at least been killed by 1918. In 2007, 2 more bodies were found. These were Alexei and what was thought to be the body of Anastasia. More DNA testing was done using the DNA of Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth of the UK, who was a direct descendant of Alexandria's sister. It was a match, and it was thus proven that Anastasia had indeed been executed by the Bolsheviks with her family in 1918. This being proven, then who was Anna Anderson? When Anna Anderson died, she was cremated, but some of her intestines had been removed and preserved after a surgery she had had in 1979. Using this, her DNA was compared to that of Karl Macher, who was a grandson of Francesca's sister, and it was a perfect match to Anna. Anna Anderson had been Francesca all along. What can we say about how this modern-day myth was allowed to go on for so long? The Romanov survival method was perpetuated by the contradictory statements of the Bolsheviks themselves. They neither confirm nor deny that they had executed the royal family, and this caused confusion which gave way to rumors. These rumors allowed a false sense of hope among members of the extended royal family as well as the Russian exile community. When a mysterious young woman showed up that bore a passing resemblance to a member of the royal family, they wanted it to be true that at least one had survived. When it comes to the perpetuation of the Anna Anderson as Anastasia myth, we can look into many different directions. One is that the whole controversy could have been cleared up in 1927 by Francesca's brother, but he decided that he wasn't sure about if it was his sister or not. Why did he do this? He then later stated that he felt his sister was being better taken care of where she was at, so he didn't speak up. She was living in a castle, after all. We also have to look at Gleb Bodkin as one of the main proponents of the myth. He never gave up that Anna was the lost princess and was her main supporter for the rest of his life. Gleb knew the actual Anastasia and would often play with her growing up. He was even there when the Romanovs and his father were executed, and he managed to hide away from the Bolshevik guards in the same house. Over the next few years, he hid out and eventually managed to leave Russia and get to the United States. He probably hoped that Anastasia had done the same as he had and got out. Perhaps the story reflects the sense of collective trauma that many that left Russia after the revolution and the Civil War faced, and they wanted to cling on to something from the past. There were many other Romanov imposters, and many of the exiles supported them too. Finally, we have to look at the role of popular culture. Anna's story gripped the popular imagination for many decades. There were books and films that were based on her life and the possibility that she was Anastasia. The most famous was from 1956, a film called Anastasia starring Ingrid Bergman that greatly fictionalized the story and captivated the audience. This was followed by a two-part miniseries in 1968 and 1997 by the animated film, also called Anastasia. Today, the story of Anna Anderson still captures people's attention, with some even still believing that she might have been the lost princess. So what do you think? Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you think. Do you think she was actually the lost princess?